I'm Joe Saunders of Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this video we're going to prepare for Flames of War's new release, Nid-War Forces for North Africa, by preparing some terrain. We're going to work with ruined desert houses and the large desert house by Gale Force 9. These are awesome models, and they're going to be a lot of fun to work with. I've been looking forward to the launch of the Mid-War Forces for North Africa. The book adds some very cool options to the mid-war scene and provides a reason to create some new battlefield options for the wargaming table. So I went about my regular business preparing for a multi-part series for building scenery for the launch. I always like to showcase some of the pre-made terrain and then switch it up with some custom work to add character in another video. There's another thing to consider here. Eventually, the lockdowns will stop, and we'll be able to start gaming again in other locations. Since the lockdowns began, I've been working on my own static terrain table, so I figured this would be a good time to let me make something portable. So, getting my hands on the large desert house and ruined desert houses for Flames of War, along with the double-sided battle mat, the one that has desert on one side and green grass on the other, I figured I was equipped. In the next video, I'll do something custom to add a personal flair to the board, but for now, I was going to work with what I had. Like all of Gale Force 9 or Battlefront's pre-made terrain, the houses were great out of the box. But like a lot of gamers, I wanted to put my personal touch on everything. I decided that a partial repaint was in order, and though the buildings were decent, they were kind of stark when I held them up to the battle mat. As my experience in the desert showed that everything had sort of a goldy orange hue to it, this would make this an interesting challenge to paint and create some variety and realism on the table. Okay, so that's enough talk. Let's get to work on the desert houses. Because I knew that the existing paint job would make a pretty good primer, I decided to just paint over top of it. I got out some old wood, put it on a large brush, and went ahead and painted it over the doors, the door frames, and around the windows. When this was complete, I moved on to the exposed bricks. I needed something that had a nice orangey tone that matched the mat and looked like the desert landscape. I mixed flat flesh with some buff until I got a suitable tone, and then just went in and, with a finer brush, painted it all over the bricks. Now I had the basic colors handled, but everything was looking a little pastel, and I needed to reinforce the depth. Grabbing sepia wash, which is an acrylic wash, I watered it down slightly with some acrylic thinner, and then just went with a big brush and heavily layered it over the whole thing. Now I began a light dry brush over the whole model. I started with deck tan, and then I went to off-white. I made sure I covered the whole model with the exception of the door, which I left as old wood. After the dry brush had dried, I then took out more deck tan and painted it in vertical lines down the door to imply wooden boards. Everything was coming along really well now, but I needed to add some shading to the inside of the windows and the doors, so I went over them with a quick wash of Army Painter Strong Tone. Once the Strong Tone had dried, the colors were pretty well established, but I felt the buildings themselves were lacking a little bit of a sense of depth. So I got out my smoked acrylic ink, watered it down slightly until it flowed evenly, and then taking out a small brush, went back and lined in. I went around the bricks, the door frames, and anywhere where I thought shadows might build. This created a lot of contrast so that the individual parts of each building stood out much better. The houses were looking good with lots of definition, but I don't think they really matched the environment yet. They needed some weathering. So I decided to use the sponge method. I got out a small piece of packing sponge, tore it up until it was an irregular shape, and then dipped this in a little German dark gray. Holding it carefully, I then went and blotted most of the paint off the sponge, and then started applying it to the building. I stippled it on here and there, more or less at random. In some spots, I drew the sponge in a vertical motion down the side of the building to create smudges. After this was finished, I then decided to go back and add some brown. I did exactly the same method using saddle brown. This looked pretty good, but now I thought my weathering pencils were in order. Taking out the weathering pencils, I put various colors on the building. I selected a very large palette of earth tones, reds, and even a little green. I applied them at different spots on the building where I thought dirt and dust might accumulate or where rust might run. When these were on and had dried a little bit, then I used a wide brush that had been moistened with just a little water and went in and blended these out to make the effects more subtle. Now I took out some varnish and sprayed down the buildings with a couple coats to protect them from the inevitable wear and tear on the games table. And with that, the project was done. The finished buildings had a well-lived-in appearance. This makes them more interesting to look at and just more realistic overall. This also helps build an engaging narrative in your games of Flames of War, which makes things that much more enjoyable. The altered colors match the battle mat, and this makes it all look very cohesive, whether you're deploying the buildings as a group to imply that they're in a village, or whether or not you deploy them separately around the board. I didn't add bases to the models, so they could remain portable, but I think they still add a ton of options to enhance your games in North Africa. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Don't worry though, there's another video coming in this series. Please check it out, and keep your eyes out for this guy, Hayu the Camel. Please remember to subscribe, and most importantly, remember to keep building life in miniature.